Hi, I'm going to share a few different ways that we can deal with behaviors at camp. So the first and foremost thing, and this is the most important thing, is try your best to be proactive. This isn't always possible, but ultimately the best intervention for a behavior is preventing that behavior entirely. So one way we can do that is to be mindful of our individual's desires, frustrations, and emotions as camp goes on. This can help us know if a potential behavior is brewing under the surface. One way that we can do this is to be empathetic. If they tell us that they want to do something, instead of dismissing it and sharing what we need to do instead, take the time to recognize, yes, I see that you want snack time right now, but right now it is time for outreach. Even though they may not be able to get what they want, knowing that you understand their wants or their needs helps prevent behaviors because they know that they're being understood. It's really helpful to clarify what they want so you better understand them, but also share what you need to do in that moment. Don't be afraid to ask your individual what's going on if they're starting to get anxious or frustrated, because that can also really help us to reduce that behavior before it starts. So a few basics of de-escalation. As I said before, we always want to address the cause of the behavior, not the behavior itself. So whenever possible, we want to try and figure out that cause. One cause might be they're wanting more attention, so we want to avoid overreacting. Sometimes our behaviors are attention-based, and so if we give them a big reaction because of their behavior, it might encourage them to do that behavior or something worse in the future. We also want to keep sensory stimulation in mind. Some kids may have behaviors because they're overstimulated or they're overwhelmed by the level of sensory input that they're experiencing. Others may be having behaviors because they're understimulated. They're not getting enough sensory input. When we look at and address their sensory needs, we can reduce the number of behaviors that they have. We also want to set and enforce reasonable limits. This allows them to have expectations of how they should act and understand the consequences of both good and bad behavior. We always want to set limits that we can enforce. If we ever set a limit that we can't enforce, for example, threatening to take away screen time after mom picks them up, if mom is going to give them screen time regardless of their behavior, then the next day it's going to be that much harder to get them to respond when we try and encourage them to do the right thing and make the right choice, and because we've lost our credibility. So we want to make sure that we're only enforcing limits that we can enforce in the day of camp. Don't forget also, it is 100% okay to say no to the individual that you're working with. While we want them to have a great time, we don't want them to be unsafe, and we want them to participate as much as possible. So if you know that they're capable of participating in a particular moment, tell them no, they can't do that activity that they're wanting to do yet, but they can do it later. We always want to use short and clear statements whenever possible as well. For example, asking somebody to sit down, it's much easier to process sit here than it is to process, hey Johnny, come over and sit, it's time for outreach. We might also remind the individual of what they're working for. If they're working for something that they want or really enjoy, we can either use starboards or we can just negotiate. We can also use schedules, so we can add in their favorite part of day into their schedule, or we can just show them how we're getting closer to their favorite activity. This is really helpful on water day when somebody's really looking forward to the slide, but it's the last activity for the day. Just showing them like this much closer to the slide, we can do it, let's participate. We also want to ignore challenging questions, so we want to redirect those questions whenever possible. If it's a question that they're just repeating over and over and over again, and you know that they know the answer, ask that question back to them. That's actually a great way to redirect them and stop that flow of thought. But if it's a question that really isn't appropriate for you to be talking about, either at church or just because that's a conversation they should have with their parents instead, redirect them by distracting them to a different topic. Finally, occasionally at camp, we do need to use restraints on individuals. We use physical techniques as a last resort. We always want to call for help before it gets to this level, which your team guide can do for you. So we want to use the least restrictive method of intervention possible, and we only put our hands on an individual if there's a threat of harm to themselves or somebody else. We also only allow people who are trained in nonviolent crisis intervention to participate in holds or restraints, just to keep everybody safe. We also never ever want to be one-on-one with an individual by yourselves. Call for a second volunteer if there's not somebody in the sensory room, or if you need to take a walk and there's nobody in the hallways. And this is just a way to protect yourself as well as the individuals that we're working with.